One of my all-time favorite Wonder Woman covers was by Jose Luis Garcia Lopez and Dick Giordano for 1978's issue number 240. On it is a black and white wanted poster featuring mugshots of Princess Diana, and it's standing on the desk of a military agent who's opening a drawer in the desk and pulling out an automatic pistol. And you also see bullets in the desk and top secret documents littered across the desk. And I like, too, that the gunman clearly has a shaky hand. Inside the issue is the story Wanted, One Amazon Dead or Alive. It's by Jerry Conway, Jose Delbo, and Joe Giella. It's the conclusion of a multi-part story. What's happening is the now-forgotten villain, the Duke of Deception, is causing Wonder Woman to see illusions. She thinks she's being attacked by Nazis, when in fact it's actually the U.S. military. So when she rips up these guys' tank and beats up a bunch of soldiers, she's walking on the fighting side of the U.S. of A. Wonder Woman is eventually overwhelmed and knocked out with the butt of a rifle, while the Duke of Deception looks on. Out at sea, the Flash, Jay Garrick, believed he was fighting a sea monster. But while trying to create a whirlpool, his massive speed manages to dissipate the illusion. Basically, he's moving faster than the speed of the sights that he's seeing, and it goes away. In jail, Wonder Woman is visited by General Darnell and Private Etta Candy, who, of course, have their condolences, but also recognize there's nothing they can do in this situation, despite Wonder Woman having been framed. Eventually, Wonder Woman is led by police to trial, where an angry mob throws things at her. I think one guy got her on the hip with a beer can. Steve Trevor is acting as her defense and confides in secret, "Don't worry, Angel, we'll get you out of this." Suddenly, a streak of blue enters the courtroom, shouting, "Ja, mein Richter! I have a most serious objection! The woman must die! She's an enemy of the Reich!" He slows down a bit, and we get a better look at him. He's mostly in all blue, with a full face mask with a swastika affixed to his forehead, and dual lightning bolts across his chest with red trunks, gloves, and boots. "I am Siegfried the Speedster, hero of the fatherland! For crimes against the Nazi party, this Fraulein must be executed by me alone!" Steve unshackles Wonder Woman, restoring her powers. "Sacco!" And as she belts Siegfried, exclaims, "As my American allies might say, Siegfried, button it." Oh, hey, look, here's full-page ads for Showcase 97 presents Power Girl, and make way for the explosive first issue of Firestorm by Jerry Conway and Al Milgram, on sale December 6th. Plus posters of Farrah, John Travolta, Jamie and Steve, the Bionic Duo, and Donnie and Marie, the Mormon Duo. Fighting a Nazi super speedster in full view of a jury does wonders for Wonder Woman's reputation, but the Duke of Deception isn't done with her yet. He sets up a local thug to gather an army that he casts in the illusion of being Nazis, who try to gun down Wonder Woman. And then a giant golem-like creature rises up from the pavement and tries to smash the amazing Amazon. Wonder Woman decides that the best way to fight this creature is by not fighting at all. And though every instinct shrieks in rebellion, the Amazon makes no move to attack. And the result is dramatic. Without resistance, the concrete giant seems to crumble with every blow it lands, until it begins to collapse like a building shored up by sand. Unbelieved, the illusion loses its force and shrivels. What was once a towering giant becomes a battered pile of earth, slumping slowly to an unmoving ground. Diana then spies the goon who is working for the Duke of Deception, lassos him, gets him arrested. It's revealed that Siegfried was in fact the Jay Garrick Flash, who was just out to help out his best gal with some trickery. And the Duke of Deception faces the angry war god Mars, who'd sent him on the mission in the first place. "You weakling! You failed me, Deception, and for that you must be punished. You've always been so vain about your deceptive good looks. Let your punishment be the stripping of illusion. Let the world see you as you really are, deep in your soul. There is your punishment, Deception." And so Mars blasts him in the face with his fingertip, and the Duke becomes a withered old man with no hair. "This is your fault, Amazon. You'll pay for this, I swear. If it takes forever, I swear, you'll suffer. Suffer!" Hey, speaking of the Golden Age, there's an overview of the crime fighters of the fabulous 40s in Amazing World of DC Comics number 16. Justice Society, Freedom Fighters, Spectre, Plastic Man, Greats of the Silver Age. And I'm guessing the art here is Mike Sikowski. And of course, the story itself overall is a nice bit of fun cheese, very much of its time. And one of the ways you can tell it's of its time is that it takes place on Earth 2 during World War II. That happened because when the 1970s CBS TV show The New Adventures of the Original Wonder Woman got started, it also took place in the 1940s. And since Wonder Woman sales weren't all that great anyway, they figured, well, we might as well emulate our multimedia partner, set Wonder Woman stories in World War II, and stay that way for several years, even though the 70s TV show actually bumped up to the present day, I believe in the second season. Which leads me to a point on this U.S. Independence Day, 4th of July episode of Diana Prince Wonder Woman. When you think of patriotic superheroes, you probably think of Captain America. The guy's name is Captain America. He's wearing a costume fashioned after the U.S. flag. And after the Shield, he was basically the second guy fighting World War II, even before the U.S. itself officially had started to. But see, in the comics, once the war ended, Cap basically went on to fight civilian menaces. And then if you trust in the Stan Lee retcon from the 1960s, Cap actually was frozen in suspended animation before the end of the war. And then on top of that, if you believe the movies, Cap's career started several years into World War II. So as a serviceman, he really was only in the military for, a couple or 3 years, I think? 5 at the most generous. And what does that have to do with Wonder Woman? Well, she's a veteran of foreign wars too. She was actually in the service from the 1940s through till the mid-80s. It's actually wrapped up in her origin. Steve Trevor crashes outside of Paradise Island into the sea. Wonder Woman saves him, falls for him, has to take him back to Man's World. He's in a coma for a little while, so she sort of has to hang out. Finally, she decides that she wants to stay in the States and close to Steve specifically, so she becomes a secretary to General Darnell, his supervisor, and by extension becomes a yeoman. But over the course of her decades of military service, she eventually worked her way up to the role of major. Now, admittedly, there are some gaps. In the late 60s through to the mid-70s, she went back to civilian life. And then there was this whole period where her World War II adventures took place only on Earth 2. But like Captain America, she fought World War II twice. Once in her original 1940s adventures, and then again during a revival. And again, unlike Captain America, she stayed in. I mean, it's right there in her costume. She's got an eagle on her chest, and her panties are the 5-pointed white stars and blue background of the American flag. Of course, she also has a red star on her tiara, so maybe she was hedging her bets in case the communists won. And of course, there's also the bracelets, so maybe she thought the South was going to rise again. This is hurting my argument. Forget I said any of that. But see, there's another interesting parallel with Captain America, too. Marvel Comics was always a fairly left-leaning company, especially from the 60s onward. Stan liked all these college kids that were reading his books, and he was playing to that audience, which was a real problem for Captain America in the early 70s because the U.S. had turned on the Vietnam War. They were very much against that conflict. There was a lot of anger directed at the military men themselves, and Captain America being presented as an avatar for the U.S. military turned him off pretty heavily to Marvel's audience. The solution Marvel came up with was having Cap distance himself from the U.S. government. There was a story arc where he helps to take down President Nixon, then becoming the Nomad, refusing to wear the colors of Captain America for a period of time. And also the simple fact that pretty much since the 70s, they've always managed to find some kind of angle where Captain America is going up against the U.S. And as much as U.S. citizens like to talk about being patriotic, really, Americans always side with the rebels. So there's nothing more American about Captain America than the fact that he fights the man more often than not. But you can also see where this would be a problem for Wonder Woman. Because again, she's part of the military-industrial complex. She did manage to skip the Nixon years by virtue of being a civilian during that time period. But then in the mid-70s, she's re-upped. At least she's fighting in the good war, WWII. But there's still that association with the military. And what's funny is she carries that through up until the mid-80s, when the sales of her books are pretty terrible. But what's funny is, in the 1980s, there was a big shift in the paradigm where the U.S. was suddenly very supportive of our servicemen, having seen the damage these guys took psychologically, the PTSD, the physical disabilities. There's a real push to support our servicemen again. And also there's a war of propaganda. Because the Cold War was still on, Ronnie scored a lot of points by butting heads with the Russians. Never mind that the USSR were themselves putting up a false front and had been in major decline since the 70s at least. And with or without Reagan, Glasnost was going to have to make its way out eventually because the Russians didn't really have another choice. But a part of that psychological chess game we were playing, you had this rising jingoism, this embracing in popular culture of militarism, very much obvious in our movies. We had Rambo and Braddock going back to Vietnam to essentially win the war that we'd lost a decade later. G.I. Joe was one of the most popular toys and cartoons. And Captain America himself wrestled with that nationalism via his conflict with the Super Patriot, later known as U.S. Agent, and sometime in the middle known as Captain America because he took over the role to better represent the America of the 1980s. So this might have been a good period for Wonder Woman to embrace her military background. And instead, with the post-crisis reboot, they blew all that material up. There were still sympathetic figures in the military appearing in Wonder Woman's book, like Etta Candy and Steve Trevor, but you still had an American military that was testing her and trying to acquire weapons from her to replicate them, like her lasso and her bracelets. Her entire first story arc is based on having to fight the militaries of the world to prevent a nuclear apocalypse. And it really wasn't too long into the Perez run that Etta and Steve faded into the background. Certainly the military aspect of their careers did. And it was frankly never to be seen again. And a big part of what's odd about that is Wonder Woman is a character that people often mention as being very difficult to write. And by focusing on the mythological aspects of the character, you're limiting the avenues by which you can tell Wonder Woman stories. Also, they made her an ambassador, so she's not even a superhero. Most of the time throughout the early years of the post-crisis series, she's touring the country, giving speeches, to some degree evangelizing for the Amazonian way of life and for for the gods they worshipped, which to some degree is commendable, but at the same time, when you've got a heroine with fantastic abilities who spends most of her time doing speaking engagements, it really feels like a waste of her talents. And it doesn't easily offer avenues for storytelling in a fantasy action medium like comic books. It made the character responsive, very passive, because threats were usually having to come up and knock on her door. And also they downplayed her martial qualities, so she was sort of this naive innocent who's constantly getting attacked, and while she successfully fends off those attacks, she's not proactive. If you go back and look at her 50s and 60s stories, a lot of them revolve around her being part of military intelligence. She's part of an investigation of some supernatural occurrence, and then Wonder Woman comes out on the scene and starts kicking butt. Often it's a matter, too, of she's working with Steve Trevor. Steve initiates action against these threats. He falters, and Wonder Woman comes in to save the day. That's much easier to write. It's much easier to position a character in stories that way. And also, if you want Wonder Woman to be an inspirational figure, serving in the military is kind of a good way of doing that. What's funny is, at the time she was in the military, you had Marvel create one of their short-lived solo heroines, Miss Marvel, Carol Danvers, who was herself part of the military. She was a fighter pilot. And so at the time of her creation, that element was clearly a ripoff of Wonder Woman. But the problem is, 10 years after the creation of this character, Wonder Woman abandons that aspect of her lore, and now it's been gone for 30 years. So a good chunk of the comic-buying public don't even remember that aspect of the character. And now Miss Marvel is about to be in a movie that's going to compete with Wonder Woman's movie, employing her classic shtick, and nobody's going to call her on it because the public doesn't necessarily remember. And you'd think that they would, because probably the single most iconic representation of Wonder Woman was the 1970s television show, where she spent the entire first season also working for military intelligence. And then when they jumped the show up to the modern day, she was still working for some nebulous government agency. So she was still acting in the interests of the U.S. government. She was still serving its citizens in an official capacity. And of course, there's also the fact that Wonder Woman drops being in the military before women actually get to be active members of the military, or at least more active members, active in a capacity closer to what we saw Wonder Woman as Diana Prince, Major Diana Prince specifically, accomplishing. So we have a whole generation or two of service women who could have been looking up to Wonder Woman. She could have been their hero, and I guess they got Scarlet instead, or Miss Marvel, which goes back to kind of limiting Wonder Woman's appeal. What also gets me is that Wonder Woman shouldn't be a martial character. That's not what she was created to be. In fact, she was specifically created by William Moulton Marston to be a figure of compassion who would show her ability to counter the evils of the world through compassion and communication, as opposed to brute strength and violence, which is what most of the other superheroes were engaged in. So the fact that she insinuated herself into the military-industrial complex, and while not compromising that mechanism, is a somewhat subversive element within it, because she's consistently solving her problems through peaceful means. Her tools are bracelets that deflect weapons and a lasso. They're not aggressive weapons. They're not violent weapons. She's in the military, but you're not seeing her running around with machine guns. She's stopping the people with guns from hurting civilians and finding less aggressive methods, in fact, sometimes outright peaceful methods, of countering their aggression, and doing it from within the system. Regardless of her point of origin, regardless of her methods, regardless of her motivations, she is still a representative of the U.S. military, engaging our enemies and resolving it with intelligence, with skill, with kindness. And she's one of ours. So it's showing that our own military doesn't necessarily solve all of its problems with bigger jets and explosions, that our military was also capable of diplomacy, and that other members of our military, like Steve Trevor, like Etta Candy, like General Darnell, recognized and valued that approach. She was their hero too. She was a hero for peace. That allowed her to be dichotomous. You've got an internal conflict there. And that's a lot more engaging than just being a hippie peacenik who's touring around giving speeches at college campuses. By taking Wonder Woman out of the military, you also take away an icon for the diversity of the military. You're taking away a representative of women who serve. You're taking away a representative of the military as a means of positive action in the world. You're limiting the sphere of iconography for Wonder Woman. You're limiting the number of people that she's allowed to represent. You're taking away story avenues. You're diminishing the character. And you're handing other characters valuable intellectual property of what's supposed to be the most iconic superheroine. And I just find that to be a shame. Because you've got 4 decades worth of stories where Wonder Woman is a U.S. hero, a patriotic hero, a military hero. And you just give it away. You downplay it. You try to forget about it. Kind of like how I forgot how I was going to make a point of how great it is that Wonder Woman is an immigrant who comes over to the United States as an adult and serves in our military. But I kind of have to, because that also forgets the part that she enters our military illegally through false identification and then worse yet, works her way into military intelligence where she's privy to confidential information, which she then shares with a foreign power, her own people on Paradise Island. So technically, Wonder Woman's entire career pre-crisis was absolutely criminal. She could be tried for espionage, probably treason, certainly jailed or deported. Okay, let me think about this some more, and I'll get back with you. I maybe shouldn't have brought all that up. So far, each of these podcasts have coincided with the release of a new issue of Wonder Woman 77 Special, this one being number 3. And it's funny because I talked with a person involved with these books fairly recently who pointed out that DC had lost the license, which is one of those bizarre quirks, not unlike Batman 66. How would you lose the license to a Wonder Woman property? But they've already solicited the 4th issue, so I'm not sure how accurate that information was. And all I know is if we don't get a Wonder Woman 77 Batman 66 crossover before anything happens with those licenses, there's just no justice in the world. Also, I say this at the same time as I point out that each of the Wonder Woman 77 specials is weaker as it progresses, and I kind of resent the book for existing when Sensation Comics featuring Wonder Woman was a better series and certainly had a greater breadth of material to draw from. But it does have another lovely cover by Nicola Scott, who is now drawing the regular Wonder Woman book, and thank goodness for that. She's spectacular on this character. And then our first story is Claymates by Mark Andreyko, who's written many of the stories to date, drawn by Richard Ortiz and Christian Deuce. In this story, there's an underground hospital for supervillains. The Batman villain Clayface is in a bad way, and there's a long line to be seen by anyone. So as he's sitting in the waiting room, he speaks with Cheetah, who clearly has a broken leg. And she points out that if Clayface needs to be revitalized, his best bet is to make it to Paradise Island, which has magical clay that would probably rejuvenate him. And she knows this because it's that magical clay that Wonder Woman was supposed to be made out of. While Wonder Woman is at a speaking engagement, Clayface turns into a clay pigeon, ba-dum-bump, and flies into the invisible jet where he hides out. Wonder Woman discovers him en route and tries to lasso him, but his malleable form just allows it to sloosh right through him. Clayface smashes through a wall in the jet and falls into the ocean, planning to swim to the beach. Wonder Woman similarly dives, and she's of course in the diving suit we saw on the old television show. Diana makes it to the beach, but by that point Clayface has merged with it and begins creating an army of Amazons out of clay to fight Diana. The actual Amazons show up to help, but Wonder Woman calls for her sisters to fall back so that they're not heinously injured by Clayface, who eventually becomes a giant statue of Wonder Woman and tries to smash her. Unfortunately, the battle is resolved when Wonder Woman touches the beach and reveals, "I am made from the clay you've absorbed, monster, thus you are part of me," and then begins controlling Clayface, causing him to dive into a volcano. Clayface survives, but he's solidified into molten rock, so Diana boxes him up and ships him to Agent Trevor. There's also a cameo appearance by Wonder Girl, as played by Deborah Winger. Not a major part of the story, though. I had a lot of issues with this particular story. The first being that Clayface is a Batman villain, and as portrayed here, he resembles the version of the character from the early 90s cartoon series. So we're not getting to see a renovated version of a Wonder Woman character. We're not seeing even a renovated version of a Batman character. We're not seeing a contemporaneous version of a Batman character. And it's all in service to propagating the notion that Wonder Woman is herself some sort of golem-like creature who has a connection to the clay on Paradise Island, which makes me extremely angry. I don't want to get into it now because I'm going to get into that when we cover her origin story in the next few months. But it's a major misunderstanding of the character and the intent of her creator to try to portray her as some sort of automaton that still has a spiritual connection to freaking clay. That's not what the character's about, and it's one of those stupid things that people fixate on because they don't have good story avenues. Everything has to be about supernatural elements, everything's got to be about mythological evidence, and it's got to be about Wonder Woman turning to clay over and over again. It's such a freaking trope with this character. It makes Wonder Woman appear to be less than human, and it just infuriates me. So, no, I didn't like the story very much. And again, I'm starting to have trouble with Mark Andreyko as a writer on this book, too, because it seems like he's running out of ideas for stories to tell in the Wonder Woman 77 setting. So he's reaching outside of the most basic conceit of the series and pushing its boundaries so much that it just makes me think I'd much rather be reading Sensation Comics again. Anyway, the next story is called Orion the Hunter, which is an unfortunate choice of name because it's got nothing at all to do with the New Gods. It's written by Christos Gage and Ruth Fletcher Gage, drawn by Dario Brizuela, I think. This book has kind of funky lettering fonts. It's hard to read. In this story, Wonder Woman and Steve Trevor uncover an inventory of illegal ivory gathered by poachers. which sends Wonder Woman on a mission to Africa, where she meets up with Grace Mabesi, who is trying to fight the poachers without the proper resources or backing from her government. Wonder Woman tries to call attention to the plight of the endangered elephants at a press conference, but a government official interferes with her communication. Then she meets up with some wardens that are supposedly helping to fight the poachers, but it turns out they are poachers themselves, hiding in plain sight. However, as previously established, Wonder Woman has a bond with the animals and calls a herd of elephants to come smash down the fortress of the poachers, and she does some serious smashing of her own. She dismantles this operation and calls another press conference. The same government official tries to get in the way, so she picks him up by the scuff of his collar and exclaims, "I can say what I choose, and I can do as I choose. So can we all. Talk to your neighbors, teach your children, make ivory worthless. This is our hope for the future." And this was a fun one, in part because I think that this is exactly the kind of story you'd have in a well-intended special episode of a TV show from the 70s. And the art is drawn by a guy who kind of resembles Gordon Purcell, who drew a lot of licensed books in the 80s and 90s, especially Star Trek. So it looks like a licensed book. If they'd actually had a Wonder Woman adaptation back in the 70s, I think it might have looked a little something like this. So it's pretty neat, nostalgic. Its heart's in the right place. So I dig on that. I'm glad that it's in the book because it fits the mission statement of the series. The next one's called Reverend Mike Loves You by Brenna Robbins and Kat Staggs. It's one of those weird digital painted kind of jobs, which goes into Uncanny Valley because there looks like there's maybe some photo manipulation in this thing or something. It's also basically Wonder Woman in Jonestown. It's hard not to leave a bad taste in a person's mouth based on that subject matter. Even though they render it fantastic, it's actually part of an alien invasion with reptilian creatures who wear human skin. It's basically Wonder Woman versus the aliens from V, but on a much smaller scale. I tend to like Kat Staggs' covers, her spot illustrations. Like a lot of painters, her panel work isn't the best. It's rather stiff, not always clear storytelling. I'm really uncomfortable because I'm not sure how much of this is done with an entirely free hand. There's just a lot of stuff here that looks like maybe there's comic book equivalent of rotoscope or something. I don't know. Not really digging it. The final story is Ocean 77 by Amanda Dibert and Spaz Johnson, with inks by Wayne Falcher. The story on this one's slow moving. It's Agent Dinah Prince and Steve Trevor pretending to be a married couple while going on a cruise that's tied up with crime on the seas. But I have to commend it at the same time because the pacing and just the nature of the story are very much in tune with 70s procedurals. They all kind of played out somewhat like this. So if nothing else, you got to give it credit for verisimilitude. I really like the art of Spaz Johnson. I remember he had a run on, I believe it was Robin, back in the 90s. And he also does a good job of evoking the era while still having a bit more of his own personal style. He's better at telling the story visually than some of the other stylists in this issue. And there is another appearance of the television show Diving Suit. There's also some mythological elements to the story. Again, it's cute, and it's the type of tale that I expect would be told in a book like the Wonder Woman 77 special. And I'll keep buying the book because I'd rather have a semi-quarterly anthology in a very specific setting over no Wonder Woman anthology at all. All right, now it's time for Wonder Words, which was the name of the letter column in the issue of Wonder Woman number 240 that I was talking about at the top of the show, and where I referenced Firestorm. And it just so happens that Firestorm Fan tweeted out an alert that Cheetah was being covered in the Who's Who Update 87 podcast that he co-hosts with Rob Kelly. Our second episode of Wonder Woman also got Twitter love from Count Druncula, Craig101, Dr. G Nerdologist, Emily Delicious, Luke Dobb, Martin Gray, and Trekker Talk Podcast, as well as Ange, Between the Pages, DCU Movie Page, Ed Moore and Ed Moore Jr. at Teal Productions and Miskatonic, Firestorm Fan, King Size Comics, Giant Size Fun Podcast, Siskoid, Synod Alias Scarecrow, and Eli Delperrin. I thank these particular folks for helping to get the word out about the podcast, letting them know that the new Wonder Woman podcast is waiting for you. Martin Gray added, and the power it possesses. Siskoid noted, you make some interesting points about Cheetah as Diana's archfoe in Challenge of the Super Friends and elsewhere. Any chance of getting discussions on the runner-ups? Dr. Cyber, Ares, the Silver Swan? A definite argument could be made for Mars/Ares, and in fact, an argument could be made that he should be number one. But I have to give a shout out to Dr. Psycho, not only because he's one of, if not my favorite Wonder Woman foes, but it just so happens that he gets referenced in the latest season, season 4 of Orange is the New Black, where out of nowhere a Martha Stewart type character is having a conversation where she brings up the polyamory and BDSM that was present in the relationships of Wonder Woman creator William Moulton Marston that influenced the creation of the character. And then one figure who was a noted misogynist on the series is called Dr. Psycho. Oh yeah, he's the one who hates women. And I was just, it boggled my mind that managed to make it into a television show. Not one that's actually on a network or anything, but Somebody out there, somebody writing that show has got to be a fan to drop a freaking Dr. Psycho reference. I like Dr. Cyber, but she's pretty much forgotten by the world at this point. And somehow nobody in the comments mentions Cersei, who would also be a very strong candidate for Wonder Woman's archenemy. Count Drunkler wrote, I've missed this show. She is one of my favorite DC villains, and for my money, Wonder Woman's most pure archenemy as opposed to Ares. My favorite incarnation is the cheetah from Justice. It's Priscilla Rich, but amped up with Minerva's powers and ferocity. The way Ross depicts her stitched together skin suit costume is amazing. Like a twisted female Buffalo Bill from Silence of the Lambs gone kinky furry. I love that she sacrifices cheetahs to take their power. It gives her a spiritual mythical quality that feels appropriate for a Wonder Woman villainess that isn't descended directly from the Olympian pantheon. Absolutely agree. Everything you said. I still think that we need a new cheetah for modern times. And although they're continuing to use the Barbara Minerva name, at least Liam Sharp has redesigned the character. I got to speak with him, and he noted that he loved how cheetahs have such distinctive faces, and he wanted to see that reflected in the villainous in his incarnation of the character. And having seen pages from Liam Sharp's coming issues, I've got to tell you, it's some of the most fantastic work of his career. I used to hold Bloodseed up from the Frontier line as probably the best work he'd ever done. I think Wonder Woman, at the very least, challenges of that. As much of an aversion I have to supporting any DC books under the current regime, especially ones featuring Wonder Woman with a sword, I'm going to be sorely tested. I'm pretty confident I'm going to end up picking up the trade paperbacks collecting both the Nicholas Scott and the Liam Sharp issues of the book. Finally, Ange writes, glad the show is back as well. I'm mostly a fan of the original Cheetah, but I've never considered her to be the antithesis villain of Diana. But she has the look for toys, which made her so obvious a choice for Super Friends. The Minerva Cheetah just showed up in a Sensation comic story drawn by Jose Luis Garcia Lopez, praise be his name, which is worth checking out, or the art alone. For me, Dr. Psycho is the ultimate villain. A hideous male with mental powers who wants to subjugate women is the exact opposite of Diana. But hard to put a sexist misogynist on a Saturday morning cartoon. I suppose Paula von Gunther or Veronica Cale could be the Lex of Diana, but also hard to put them in a cartoon as they would just be female versions of Luthor. Glad to hear your thoughts on the runs people talked about. I haven't collected Wonder Woman since Azarello Chang left, and the Warrior First Stepford wife in Superman Wonder Woman is insulting. Look forward to next season's podcast. So thank you, Ange, for giving me a good case for Dr. Psycho. I like Paula von Gunther. I haven't had a ton of experience with her. I remember her from the TV show. Her appearances in the Byrne comics weren't as strong. I'm not sure how potent Dark Angel is as a villainess, but I can say for a fact that I greatly disliked Veronica Cale. It was actually one of my major sticking points in the Greg Rucka run because she was so obviously Wonder Woman's Lex Luthor, and it really bugged me that that was the character they chose to adapt for the David E. Kelly television show, which I really ought to cover for one of these podcasts. You guys get back with me if you want me to put a rush on that. Veronica Cale is just so easy. It's just like they use Maxwell Lord on the Supergirl television show. It's just so easy to have an evil suit stand in as an analog for Lex Luthor regardless of whether or not it reflects their actual personality. But in the case of Veronica Cale, she really is just Lex Luthor as a blonde woman. My hope is that that character is forgotten and never seen again. I know that the Rucka fans seem to like her. I'm not a Rucka fan. I don't like her. I don't ever want to see her again. It was an extra long wait on this episode. I think that you'll get a much more speedy response to Wonder Woman 77 Special number 4, in part because I've read the early issues of The Legend of Wonder Woman and the Wonder Woman Earth 1 graphic novel, and I really want to cover those, but it didn't fit the theme of this episode, so I have a strong impetus to jump right on the next episode when it's due. But until we get serious about celebrating the 75th anniversary of Wonder Woman in podcast form, it probably will be a wait until that book is out before the next episode. We'll see y'all then. Wonder Woman is the copyright of DC Comics Entertainment. This is a non-profit fan-produced podcast. No infringement of any copyrights are intended, and where copyrighted material appears, it is believed protected under fair use. If you enjoy the show, please feel free to leave a comment on the Diana Prince is the New Wonder Woman blog, the Rolled Spine podcast blog. Write to me at emailofdiabolu@yahoo.com, featuring 2 underscores, or just hit me up on Twitter at Commander Blanks or at Rolled Spine. Thank you for listening, and have a wonderful week.